Hello and welcome to Talking Leadership. This is Eric Perez. Thank you for joining me once again for another great discussion around this leadership topic. I'm wanting to put out a thank you to everyone who's been following the podcast and providing some very good and constructive feedback. I'm hoping you're enjoying the content, and I'm especially looking forward to today's discussion. So before we kick off and I introduce my podcast guest, I'll just give you a bit of a background. My guest today, has been the manager for customer service and business performance at Redland Shire Council. She has also been the manager of performance solutions at the Local Government Association of Queensland and is currently a local government specialist under the moniker of Nat Kent Consulting Proprietary Limited. So can I welcome to the podcast Natalie Kent? How are you, Natalie?
I'm very well, Eric. Thank you for having me.
Mate, it's fantastic. Mate, I'm very happy to have you on the podcast, and for the sake of completeness for the listeners, I had one of my first full-time roles with Natalie many years ago at the LGAQ. It was for me my probably my favourite job to date, other than my current role, obviously, for lots of different reasons. And I say that in the context of being a young person going into the world of work and having a manager and a mate and a good leader in that when I was with the LGAQ. So that's how I know Natalie, and that's why I've got her on the podcast today. So Nat, I'd like to start the podcast with you the way that I've done with all the podcasts and ask you, what was your first industry leadership role and why did you take that on, mate?
Well, my first industry leadership role, I will say, was local government. I did work at Cloncurry for a while, but when I moved to Bowen Shire, I took on a higher role and I actually worked directly for the CEO there. And that was sort of the real start to leadership. And in that role, I had some staff, but that wasn't where I saw leadership from. I ran a number of programs. I had Indigenous employment programs and other work programs where I had the opportunity to help counsel some people in work when they weren't turning up, doing those sorts of things, and trying to help those people get into the workforce. So that was sort of, I guess, what I looked back, and I did a whole heap of things before that, but the really one where I say, hey, I was really starting to demonstrate a leadership profile.
Thanks, Nat. So in just to unpack that a little bit, and I've asked this in other discussions that I've had, did you purposely seek that role, or was that something that you morphed into by being sort of identified by another leader in the organisation that said, hey, would you like to give this a crack? Do you want to have a chance at doing something different? Was it like that, or did you seek out that particular role that you just discussed before?
Well, to be honest, they didn't have a role. I went to see the CEO when I moved to town, and CEO said, what can you do? Because I had local government experience. And I said, this is what I can do. I'm studying my local government degree at the time. And he said, well, can you start Monday? And this is what I'll give you as a job. It was a niche job. It was very different to what they had. So they actually didn't have a job. But they did have a need for someone. And the person that they thought could do that role turned up on the door. And so they created the position.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. And some of us can relate to finding those kinds of positions in our career. So now, in your travels, have you found a difference between leadership and what we call management?
Oh, I'm certainly there is a difference. And I look at management as being more about a process and being able to tick the box. Have I done these things? Have I not done those things? And it is very easy, or a lot easier, to document the process of just pure management. But once you get into leadership role, you've really got to think about the skills, the diversion, the strategy, the broader thinking, the humanisation of thinking and people. So I see management being more robotic and leadership being more personal, if you can understand what I'm trying to
and thank you for making the distinction. That's come up a couple of times as well, is that and I'm not denigrating management in any terms, but I think mechanistic is the best word that I can come up with for the management process. In there is a series of steps and it's a repetitive thing, whereas with leadership, it's not necessarily about process, but about people, about the organisation in grander terms. Is that fair assessment?
Yes, that's fair assessment. And it is about, leadership is about being a bit more particular about individual pieces of that puzzle and not so vanilla. You can't treat every situation exactly the same in leadership. In management, you can.
That's brilliant. A segue into the next question. Now, leaders sometimes make mistakes. How do you engage with an error or mistake that was attributed to your leadership, Nat?
I've made plenty, and you do, in the heat of whether it be the heat of the moment, whether it be the information you got. But look, if you're a good leader, you apologise to their face, and explain your thinking. It's not an excuse, but explain your thinking on where you went wrong, why you went wrong. Move on then. After that happens, move on, and really show that apology was sincere through your deeds. It's about actions, how you actually work with that person going forward. So if there is a breakdown in relationship over leadership decisions, don't hold that against the person for time. Just get over it and get on with it. So mend the relationship and move forward.
Sure. So do you, just as a follow-up to that question, have you in your travels looked at areas and mistake making by either yourself or others as a learning opportunity?
Oh, absolutely. Because when you go back and reflect, and it's even just something you may have said, and I have said things in my day and gone that night, thought about that and thought, geez, what if that person thinks I was meaning something else, And I did something very recently, and it was about a particular building project we got, and this particular person wanted it to go a different way, and I said to her, you're not special. And then I thought about that afterwards. And the next day I went back and I went to her and I said, I've got to apologise to you. And she said, what are you going to apologise for? And I said, because yesterday when we were having our conversation, I said you weren't special, and you are special. And she is very special, that person. She didn't even hear me say it. But as a leader, those words come back to you through the night, and you go, I could have said that better. What if I've sent the wrong message? So that's a good example of, when you're a good leader, you pick up on things that you've said and correct them, even if the person doesn't think you've done it wrong.
And it's a very human thing to make mistakes, and I guess in a work context, it maybe not to blow out of proportion a mistake that comes from working, because we spend a good chunk of our lives in amongst the work environment and in amongst other human beings, and I've yet to find the perfect human being, and I'm far from that. So, I understand what you're saying. So, Nat, not to draw on a negative here, but what's the most difficult part from your experience about being a leader?
I think getting the people that may report to you or are around you to understand that all are not equal. That the decisions that are made are for the information that you have at hand, and you don't always have control of what happens. I think it's really hard for leaders when they have information that they can't share, confidential information, for example, that they can't share with people in their teams or their people that report to them, and they wonder where the organisation's going. So why is this leader not filling us in, and that's an unsafe place for staff to be in. From a leader's point of view, you haven't chosen to be in that position, but you have to go through that management process that I was talking about If that's the steps that we have to go through, we have to go through. So that becomes very difficult. And you need to treat the individuals that you're trying to lead very, very differently. And some will see that as you treating them not the same is unfair. And that's not the case at all. That's
Sure.
one of the lessons I've learned, because each is exactly that individual, and you need to nurture and help and support them through, and maybe kick them up the backside.
Yeah, I've had a few of those. How do you measure success as a leader?
Oh, and you like this one, Eric, when someone comes back and asks for a reference after a long time, when a staff member apologises to you for taking things out of perspective, even though you did not challenge them. And I had that happen where someone wasn't happy with a decision I made, and they made a whole hoo-ha about it. But when all the facts came through, that person came back and apologised to me. I was never going to hold it against them, because I think it was, again, a learning curve. I've had a number of staff move on out of my life to other things and have become very successful and have reconnected. And not just you, Eric. There's been another want to be a referee 10 or 15 years after they worked for me. And I think, geez, the referee from me now mightn't be, useful to them, because they were a different person in a different time. But they valued that. So, that has really made me think that's some of the measures I've put against myself.
Is your interaction with staff? Yeah, that's it's an interesting perspective, Nat. So I've got this is going to be some fun now. So I've got 3 statements here that I want your views on, and there's no right or wrong answer here, but I know we're going to have some fun with these particular statements. So here's the first one: on the job experience develops a better leader.
Oh, life and work experience both will influence leaders if they let it, and certainly taking on board. So it's a lot about attitude as well, on how you deal with that job experience.
Sure.
Because you can believe that you've got all the experience, and you don't, you're going to impart your experience on the role, or you can actually do the opposite and use that as a way of absorbing from what's happening in an organisation to improve you as a leader.
So as a very close follow-on to that first statement, do you believe that formal education helps to develop better leaders?
I don't think it's 100% necessary. We can have a look at some of the most successful leaders in the world had no formal education, and I'm a failed Year 10 student. I didn't do a senior high school, but I have 2 degrees. So a measure of how well you can do in your life is not how well you did at school, so that's one. But I think knowledge of modern management, what influences people, and the theory does help. But it's no match for experience. I mean, having the theory is great, but you've actually got to put it into practice to really grow well. And I think it's been a good balance for me. It may not be for others. They may just learn on the job and be able to go up to the top of leadership without that formal experience.
So it's been described to me, Nat, as that education, or particularly formal education, becomes just another tool, part of the toolkit that leaders can draw on to do what they do on a daily basis. So that melds in, I think, quite nicely to what you're saying, that experience gives you certain street cred, and yes, formal education can help with that, but it doesn't necessarily stop you from being successful. And I only make that observation from some of the other podcast guests that I've had. A few come to mind that have been entrepreneurial and finished grade 12, did not go to university, have now started flourishing businesses in an area where they had some passion for the topic area, and have suddenly grown businesses from that perspective, and have said, yes, as I've grown older into the role of running a business, that going back to university or back to TAFE or wherever it is to get post-secondary education, that's helped and just added a suite of new tools to what they could already do, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, here's the last one, and this one I will put my hand up and say I have a view, and I'm definitely a fence sitter on this one, but you may have a different view, and I'm hoping you'll share it with us. Leaders are born, not made.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both, Eric. Honestly, there are natural leaders; they do occur. There are people that have that, just substance within them to be able to do that, whether it be in the schoolyard, and that may be a negative leader, or a positive leader. But I think it helps if you've got the attributes, and I'm talking about, if you do things like Myers-Briggs, that if you have a look at those attributes that select with leaders, that helps you move into that leadership role. Others, struggle with some of those attributes you need to be a good leader. So talking about your introverts, if they can't communicate well, and not all introverts can't, but some do. So I think most are made through opportunity and determination. So I think that, if you've got that, heart that wants to do this, and that's probably more where the natural leader comes from. It's a goal. It's something in your heart that you want to do, but you need that toolkit to actually make you successful. So I think some are born, but not necessarily. That's not the full amount of their success.
And it's an ongoing thing that I think I'll speak for my people, and by my people I mean the introverts of the world. That you have to work at being a good communicator, and it does take time. And I think experience is the best teacher when it comes to building up an ability to build rapport, to demonstrate empathy, to put yourself in the position of others, and that. I got to see that writ large in my role with LGAQ, with yourself and other managers that were there, that gave us younglings an opportunity to make mistakes and be able to talk them through, and to not get sort of bashed over the head for that first mistake, so long as we learnt something from what we did, because continually making the same mistake, obviously you're not learning from that. But I have to admit, I've, like yourself, in my travels I've seen people that are very good leaders that to me were probably built up and given the opportunities to become those leaders, but a natural leader with that X factor, I think they're to me they exist, but they're a rarity around the place. And I've met some of those people, not in professional standing, but those people that are volunteers, that do selfless things for the community, that volunteer for things like the local the emergency services and stuff. These are people that aren't in paid positions, but are just doing stuff to enhance their communities. And I wanted to get your feeling on that, because that was something that was brought up in a podcast that I've yet to publish, where the person that I was speaking to did make mention of having that complete rounded person. And just for the sake of curiosity, outside of your roles with local government, what other things have you done in that leadership space that have helped you to get to where you've gotten to professionally?
One of the things that my husband and I did was we took on some students in Indonesia, and we put them through university. So we used the things that we had, which was a small amount of money, to actually try and be leaders to those people. And we spent time and went over there with their families and encouraged them. And when things got tough for them, one of the girls that we were putting through, she got pregnant, had to get married, and she thought we would just abandon her, and we didn't. We did the opposite. We said, well, that's what happens, and we want to encourage you to study. So, those they're the things, and the having the passion to actually make others' lives better through that is what I like to do, other than in a paid. And we've got 3 of them, and the two are married. One got married on the 1st of July in Indonesia. We didn't end up going to the wedding, but and he'll have a family now, and the other girl, she's yet to marry, but their lives, they can't thank us enough for this small amount of effort that we really put in to help change those people's lives, just through a little bit of leadership of finding a way of doing something in a foreign country with no tax. We don't get a tax deduction or anything for it. It was just something that we wanted to actually give back and be thankful for, the opportunities that we'd had and the opportunities that people who I worked for and were around me gave me as I was coming along.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's come up, and like I said, the person that I was speaking to in another podcast sort of made mention, and he used the term about place. So because he was working in a rural community or a regional community, that he was a big part of that community outside of what he did professionally for work, and that volunteerism, that spirit of community, giving something back, helped him to be a better leader in his formal work. So I can see where that connection comes in, and it's one of those things that I think the literature talks about a little bit around leadership, but doesn't bring up is what are the other things that leaders do to enhance themselves in their roles without making that necessarily making that connection. So when you're out and you're not doing work type things in inverted commas, then you're living your life. There's things that you're doing every day that could enhance the way that you treat people, and that translates to what you do at work. And that level of analysis and that level of discussion, I think, can be had a lot more of, because I especially want to, and you've made what you do known, and that's fantastic. And that, I think it's an area to explore, because when you live your life outside of work, there's things that you're doing that you may not necessarily know are enhancing what it is that you do in that workspace, and that can be necessarily a good thing, because it expands your mind to how people function, and not, people go to work for different reasons, obviously, and so if you can put yourself in the boots of another person, I think it makes that work life a lot easier to deal with. So look, Nat, a couple of final questions for you to have a think about for me, and I'm particularly keen to get your view on this. And I'm not looking for, and I've said this before to the listeners, that I'm not looking for necessarily agreement, but I'm doing some studies at the moment around leadership, and I'm looking at two particular areas around leader capability, so strategic thinking and foresight. I believe, based on what I'm looking at in the literature, that these two areas are important for leaders into the future. Well, what are your views around the issue of strategic thinking and foresight, Nat?
Okay, well, this particular question, Eric, I'm going to have to agree with you on that, because I know strategy is one of my great strengths. You won't beat me on strategy on a lot of things if we want to get into it. And it certainly helped my success, being able to put in it. And it's more than just a plan. There's planners, but there's people who, because strategy is that more critical thinking. It's keeping up with knowledge, then analysing those data and the information, and that is needed to support a strategy. So, I do that naturally. As some people just talk about natural leaders, well, I'm naturally in that space. I think it was a space I didn't know that I was so good at. And yet when I look back and some of the things I did pre-local government, when I worked in transport industry, I worked in engineering and did work for government and welfare industry. I now look back at those things and realise that I was successful in those things because I was actually good at strategy. So that strategy and foresight and being able to think critically, I think, is something that if leaders don't have it, they need to try and improve that space. To be
sure. So here's one that, again, just let me unpack that a little bit. And I don't necessarily disagree that it's something that each individual leader can improve in their own right. But do you think leaders, and this is very much dependent on the organisation and your circumstances, but do you think that you can buy in that skill and not necessarily need to hone it yourself, or do you think you need to do it irrespective of being able to buy those skills into a particular role that you might have?
I think you can do both, and it depends on what the role is. But generally, a lot of that strategic thinking is done intuitively. You don't even realise you're doing strategy.
Okay, yep.
And that's why it's quite difficult to buy, because you've got to recognise when you need it to buy it in. And in a lot of cases, you're actually doing it as part of your leadership role without even realising it, because it is just part of your skill and how you are. And that's how
I wasn't laughing at you, Nat. I'm laughing at how stupid I am. So how do you know to buy strategic thinking skills into the place if you don't know what that is, or have a feeling for it? Yeah, okay. Well, for the listeners there, I've just demonstrated how much of an idiot I am, but there you go. None of us perfect. Okay, no, that
wasn't.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Oh no, it's okay. Look, I've grown up enough to know when I've been silly about something. But yeah, that to me makes sense. And the reason I asked the question that I asked was that I'm starting to pick up from people that, depending on the situation, that if you don't have a skill set, and let's say person X or myself, I know that, okay, I've got some skills in strategic thinking, but I know that person X I might be able to bring into the place that in very short time they can get across what are the big ticket issues and can start seeing some possible futures around, hey, what do we need to do to meet specific targets or goals. And I think strategy, and here's another question I've got for you, because the strategic thinking thing is of particular interest to me, and I hope the listeners will let me go down this track a little bit, is that in your travels, have you found that time is always the enemy with getting that stuff rolled out? Because is it always time dependent, or do you just have to react to the circumstances as they present themselves?
I think in a lot of situations that I work in, it is more reactionary. You have to be able to do the strategy on your feet. And a lot of management positions, you aren't afforded the time to spend, unless it's a specific project or something that you can, put a timeline around. Let's, really sit down and do strategic thinking about this and bring a lot of people in and get across it. And a lot of times in your work life doing these things with the pressures that are on now, you actually have to be able to come up with that solution on the fly. And that is a skill in itself. So hence why when you were saying if people don't have those skills, they need to hone in on those skills and improve those skills and look at ways of substituting those skills or getting better at those skills. Because it is important, and I think as the pressures come on, as we become a more mobile workforce, there's an expectation of higher levels of performance from people. You're going to need to be very strategic in how you operate. You've got to be able to cherry pick the biggest bang for your buck out of a whole suite of things on the fly.
Yeah, okay, Nat, that's an interesting perspective. Look, Nat, and this is the last question, and it's been a favourite of mine. What would you say, Nat, now looking at Nat back as a younger version of yourself, what would you say to that younger version of yourself about being an effective leader?
I would say don't be so hard on yourself. I think, I try and strive, and I beat myself up over, a few small things that I might do or say. I think it's taken me a long time to understand that everybody else is having the same experiences. As they're young, they're all learning, they're all beating themselves up over things that, they didn't get 100% right. And that you're not alone in the climb, and probably to use more peers to talk to about those things. Rather than suffering it out on your own and going, I've got to learn this, I've got acquire these skills. I've got to do that, and I've got this feeling that, am I right or am I wrong here, and share that a little bit more. But I think the most important one is seek out mentors and then be one. Now, certainly in the people that helped and mentored me, a number of managers I came through, and I look back and I think I would not be where I am for those few people, and not all of them did that. Some of them put a obstacle in. They mentored me, I guess, in a different way. They put an obstacle in front of me and see how I would achieve, where others, really genuinely helped me over the obstacle. They didn't just stand on the other side. And I think that's a trap for young people. So that if they look out for people that will assist them over those obstacles, be mentors for them, and then when you get older and wiser, and I don't think you're going to get that until you're probably getting to my age, because I'm just starting to feel that I'm getting there, and your life's nearly done, your work life's nearly done, but certainly be one, be a mentor.
This has been Eric Perez from Talking Leadership, and thank you again, Natalie.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
No worries, mate. Appreciate it. And thanks to everyone, and I'll catch you all on the next podcast.